Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Hopefully the AC is not too loud. It kicks on and off in this building. You'll probably hear that as we go. But today I want to just take a moment to share with you a review of this little book by Jason Helopoulos, Covenantal Baptism. You may have, if you're in the kind of Presbyterian Reformed world, you may have seen a couple of books that look a lot like this, same kind of size and design, different colors. But they're all part of a new series called the Blessings of the Faith series that P&R is putting out. And they're written by different authors. David Strain did one on expository preaching. Guy Richards did one on persistent prayer. And then Jason Helopoulos, who is actually the editor for the series as a whole, wrote this book, Covenantal Baptism, just a year or two ago. I think 2021 is when it was published. And I just picked this up and read it recently. I was teaching on the doctrine of baptism from the Westminster Confession of Faith to our youth group. That's what we do for our youth group at our church. Once a month we go through a chapter of the Confession of Faith. And I thought it'd be helpful to get a kind of summary statement of this. This is a very accessible book, as you can see, not that big, less than, well, just right around 150 pages. And he's basically trying to introduce people to a Presbyterian and Reformed, a covenantal view of baptism. And so I wanted to just share some thoughts on the book. It's laid out very, very helpfully. Jason Helopoulos is the pastor of University Reformed Church up in Lansing, Michigan. He worked for many years alongside of Kevin DeYoung, and then when Dr. DeYoung took the call to go down to North Carolina, Jason Helopoulos became the senior pastor at University Reformed Church, which is now part of the PCA. Very healthy church. He's a very just pastoral guy. And you can tell what he's writing comes out of conversations that he's had with people. And so he does a really good job of, laying out biblical arguments and theological arguments, but always with an eye toward the questions that people actually have, the things they're actually wrestling with. And that makes this book uniquely valuable because it's not the kind of deep dive, theological work, or it doesn't answer every exegetical question. It's not going through the history of all of these things. If you're a theology nerd who's really grappling with this question, it's not going to do a deep dive into all of those things. However, it does cover a lot of what needs to be covered, and it does it in a way that would be great for a new members class or handing to someone who is new to a Presbyterian Reformed church, because he does a great job of framing the discussion, framing the questions, walking through the basic argument, and then dealing with a lot of the questions that people have. And you can kind of see that even in the structure of the book. So there's 5 chapters, and then the 6th section are questions and answers. And that's actually a feature of this Blessings of the Faith series. All of the books kind of do that. They have a couple of chapters, and then they'll have a pretty significant section. Maybe a third of the book will just be answering common questions that people have. And that's a really unique aspect of this book and the series as a whole. But he begins by framing the subject of baptism through the lens of the kindness of God. He says what we're seeing in baptism is not primarily something for us to fight over in terms of the mode. It's not a kind of shibboleth that we use to say, oh, okay, you have the right view of this or you have the wrong view of this. He does believe there's a right view. He's going to argue for it. But he wants to prep our hearts to say, as we enter into this, let's not approach it as a kind of puzzle to solve or a code to crack. What we have in baptism is actually an expression, an overflow of the kindness of our God, that he enters into relationship with us. He enters into covenant with us. And he's giving us baptism as a sign of that covenant, right? So in the same way that those of us who are married have given and received wedding rings, there's all sorts of aspects to that, but fundamentally what's being expressed there is an overflow of our love. And when we see that ring that we've received from our spouse, this speaks to me of my wife's love. And in the same way, baptism speaks to us of God's kindness. And that's a good way of framing it as a whole. Then he walks through in chapter 2 what he calls the fourfold stream of testimony. In other words, for those who who come to a Presbyterian church and they see particularly an infant being baptized, they might wonder, where in the world do you get that from? And he says, well, there's really kind of four things that we're looking at that are drawing us towards the practice of covenantal baptism. He goes on to clarify, we all believe in believers' baptism. In other words, someone who's outside the church professes faith, they should be baptized and become a Christian. The relevant question is not, do you believe in believers' baptism? We all believe in that. The relevant question is, does God continue to include children in the covenant as he did in the Old Testament or not? And he argues along 4 lines that we should still see children as being part of the covenant, and therefore as being party to the sign of the covenant, which in the Old Testament was circumcision, and the New Testament is baptism. So as you can kind of tell from the way he's framing it already, he begins by talking about the testimony of covenantal continuity. The Old Covenant and the New Covenant are not the same, obviously, but there is continuity that's there, and that leads us to tie these things together. There's also the testimony of the New Testament. He goes through, Peter's sermon at Pentecost and Paul's comparison of circumcision and baptism, some of the things of the letters, a number of these kinds of things that lead us to think God still deals with his people in a similar way, dealing with you and your children, as we'll find that language. Thirdly, he talks about the theological testimony, just the way that God uses and talks about the family in the Bible, the corporate nature of our faith, the testimony of the church, or the theology of baptism. And then fourthly, he mentions the testimony of the church. So looking at what has been the common practice of the church down through the centuries. And he he says it's really as you bring those 4 threads together that you get a good picture and argument for why Presbyterians will practice covenant baptism that way. I think that's a very helpful kind of summary. There's a lot more he could talk about under each of those headings, but it's a good way of kind of just laying out, what are the things that move Presbyterians to do what they do, so that you could at least understand where they're coming from if it's new to you. One of the things he does next then, and really the rest of the book, is he has a chapter on how baptism is a blessing to the children who receive baptism, which is a very important chapter. It gets into a lot of the clarifiers that need to be given about what baptism does and doesn't do. And in a Presbyterian view, we have kind of a moderating position. On the one hand, you have a whole stream of Christian thought. There's different, articulations of this, but that hold to some version of baptismal regeneration. In other words, there's this idea, at a minimum, that God is always at work in baptism in the sense of bringing people into not just the visible church, but the invisible church, giving them new life. Now, most people that hold to that idea would also hold that you can lose or people can reject that work of God. But God is always and automatically at work in baptism. That's one of the means he always chooses to use. And at the moment of baptism, God is doing something. Again, there's a lot of ways of parsing that out, but that's one broad stream of thought. Most evangelicals in America today have a very different view, where they say, no, baptism is not something that God works through. It's really just a symbol that he gives to us. Some of them will appreciate the fact that it's not primarily a symbol of what I do for God. It's also a symbol of what God does for me. Most people, everyone would recognize it is saying something about what we're doing, what we're saying to God, our identification with the community, the church, and so forth. But there's often a tendency to say, well, no, God's not at work in this at all. Presbyterians, again, have a somewhat of a moderating view, where we say, actually, it is a means of grace. God chooses to work through baptism and through the Lord's Supper to convict people, to convert people, to show his love and kindness to people, to give forgiveness of sins, all of these things. However, here's the key difference. We don't believe that it's something that happens automatically or mechanically, if I can just kind of put it that crassly, but rather it's a means that the Spirit uses. So what's central here is not just the waters of baptism, but the work of the Spirit. We do believe that the Spirit can work through the waters of baptism to do these things, but we don't confine the Spirit to that and say every time water is poured out on someone's head that the Spirit is doing X, Y, and Z. So a good way of grabbing this is to think of it in terms of what we all would recognize as a means of grace, which would be the preaching of the gospel. What's happening when the gospel is faithfully preached? Well, we can run off a list of things that the Spirit does. He brings conviction of sin. He grants forgiveness for sin. He gives newness of life. He regenerates us. He justifies us. He sanctifies us. We might become adopted in the context of listening to the preaching of the gospel. So in that sense, we can say God does all of these things through the means of grace of the preaching of the word. Does that mean that every time the word is preached, those things are happening? No, not necessarily. The Spirit might choose to work in that moment, or he might not. He might choose to open someone's eyes, or he might choose to harden someone's heart. We see that happening in the Bible. And so we don't limit the Spirit to this means, but we also don't disconnect the Spirit from these means or say, no, God can't work in this. All that's happening in baptism is a symbol or a picture or something that I'm saying to God. That's not what we see in the Bible. And so the Presbyterian view sees that while we don't want to become mechanical in our understanding of the blessings of baptism, that there are still blessings of baptism. God often uses the works in these things, and the Spirit is free to do that. And so he does a good job of kind of, again, giving all those qualifiers, walking through those arguments, and explaining how baptism is a blessing to the children who receive it. What he does beyond that, then, I think a lot of books on baptism will kind of do some of what we've talked about. Here's the argument for why we include children, and here's exactly what's happening to children when they're baptized. That's really important. What he adds to this is also seeing how baptism is a blessing to the parents, right? How it helps us as parents who are bringing our children, and how it's calling us to raise them in a certain way. And he walks through very pastorally, I think, like 6 or 7 things that we as parents are called to do and are able to do through baptism. So it's a really wonderful section of the book. And then he also talks about how it's a blessing not just for that little family, but for that family as they become part of the family of God, as they become part of the congregation. And so he talks about, again, what baptism means, not just to the individual. That's one of the ways we get tripped up on this as modern people. We think of it as in an individualistic way. But he's saying, no, it's a corporate thing. It's a corporate sacrament and has implications for the child, for the parent, and for the congregation. And it's a wonderful part of the book. And then again, he has about 40 pages where he's just answering common questions people have. So when you put all this together, it is probably the best one-stop shop intro that I've found for introducing your kind of average American evangelical to a Presbyterian and covenantal view of baptism. For those who have read a lot about this subject, you're probably not going to find anything new here, although he does put some things very well and give some very pastoral applications that are helpful. But there are other books you could read if you're trying to kind of do a deep dive into the history or theology of this. But if you're someone who has just never really understood why Presbyterians do what they do, or if you're talking to someone who's just kind of confused about that and they want to understand, I think you'd be hard-pressed to do better than to give them this book. It has discussion questions at the end of every chapter. It's very pastoral, it's very warm, it's very balanced. I think it does a great job of addressing those things. It will probably be a little less helpful if you're interacting with someone who is, Lutheran or Roman Catholic, someone who practices infant baptism like a Presbyterian would, but for different reasons. He'll lay out some of the things that would come into play there, but he doesn't have that person in mind. What he has in mind very much is the firm advocate of believers baptism, believers only baptism, we would say, who's broadly evangelical or Baptistic, who's coming into a Reformed context. And that's what this is written for. And I think it does a phenomenal job of that. So if that's a need that you have or something that would be helpful for you, I would strongly encourage you to pick up a copy of Covenantal Baptism by Jason Helopoulos.